Segregation. Yeah, that's ugly. It's just ugly. It's bad and nobody likes it and it's gone now. Traveling by Grace Paley. Now, it's a 3-part poem story thing, and it was written by a Jewish woman who was growing up in the 1930s, and as you may know, Jewish, so anti-Semitism. And the 1930s is around when a lot of bad stuff was happening. We still had a lot going on. Traveling is about a girl and her encounters on the bus, except for the 3rd part, which is about a reminiscence. The 3rd part is about them reminiscing about their mother and so on, but that's basically the gist of it. In the first part of the poem, you'll see Grace using dialogue and allusions to better explain her point of view, or her mother's point of view. Okay, so Traveling by Grace Paley, it was written in 3 parts. One being her mother and her sister's experience on the bus and their experiences with segregation. And the 2nd part being about Grace's own experience on the bus with a black mother and her child. In part 1, we see Grace's mother and sister on a bus ride. And as we all know, back in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, back in the 1930s, 40s, we had very segregated bus lines, as in the black people would sit in the back and the white people would sit in the front. And as Grace words it, an invisible racial border. So, as you can tell, it's bound to have some bad things with people who are more or less in the middle and, you know, separated by this invisible border. Now, in Grace's mother and sister's case, they are on the bus and they are sitting 3/4 of the way back. A white man comes and approaches them. As I explained before, white people would sit in the front, black in the back. So it was weird to the people around them that they would still be in the back after more people had got on. When Grace's mother was approached about this, what she said, no. Just flat out, she said no. And as Grace says, when I first tried to write this scene, I imagined my mother saying, "That's all right, mister, we're comfortable. I can't change my seat every minute." But she read it to her sister, and her sister was like, no, that isn't how that went. What really happened was they had tried to get her to move, but she wouldn't. She didn't think that she deserved to sit at the front. She just believed it wasn't right. So she didn't move, and she said no, and nobody stopped her. That they had just been discriminated against before. They understood what it was like, so why would they put someone else through that? You know? They were more understanding of it. It was like that. As later on in the passage, you'll read, he had a classmate, a Jewish boy like himself, but from Virginia, who had a public confrontation with a Negro man. He had punched that man hard, knocked him down. My brother couldn't believe it. He was stunned. He couldn't imagine a Jewish boy wanting to knock anyone down. They just don't think it's normal to hate someone because of their race or their skin, and that's what Grace's family believes. And they're right in believing that. One really does show you about how people will stand up for themselves. They'll stand up for other people. Hate your color, the color of your skin, and the way you look. Not everyone's always gonna think that you belong or you're different and you should be in a different seat, as is the case with Grace's mother. 2, Grace is on a bus herself. She says about 15 years later. This was in 1943, so segregation was still a pretty big thing. Passage, she's going to visit her husband in Miami Beach, and that's a 3-day bus trip. And as Grace writes, so many hours. The movement of the passengers was something like a tide that sometimes ebbed and now seemed to be noisily rising. I opened my eyes to the sound of new people brushing past my aisle seat. But while people were going on to the bus, she saw her standing right next to her. She saw that she had a baby. And obviously, you see a mother who's obviously exhausted and tired with a newborn, or a child, I should say. What Grace did, being the kind-hearted woman that she was, is she offered the black woman a seat. She declined. But Grace persisted and said, "At least let me hold the baby." So in tiredness, exhaustion, and so on, she did. Well, Grace had held him, and she liked it. She didn't mind it. She thought it was cute. She writes, I liked holding him, aligning him along my 20-year-old young woman's shape. Had to that holding, that breathing together, that wouldn't happen in my life if this war would never end. Though, of course, things can't just go that smoothly. I mean, why would they? We're talking about the 1950s here. Everyone hated everybody. A white man had approached her and was like, I wouldn't touch that thing with a 30-foot pole. You know, he was racist. Yeah, this white man comes along and he's like, hey, no, that's gross. You shouldn't do that. And as Grace words it, in a loud voice, he addressed me. Lady, I wouldn't have touched that thing with a meat hook. Very Grace was like her mother and she stood her ground. So as Grace says, I did not look away from him. Then I held that boy a little tighter, kissed his curly head, pressed him even closer so that I began to squirm. So sleepy, he reshaped himself inside my arms. His mother tried to narrow herself away from that dangerous border, too frightened at first to move at all. After a couple of minutes, she leaned forward a little, placed her hand on the baby's head, and held it there until the next stop. I couldn't look up I couldn't look up into her face. And that sums up part 2. She stood up for herself and she showed everyone that she doesn't believe in segregation. And she made a change in that mother's life, as is assumed by part 3. As terrible as it may seem, it's not bad to possibly stand up for you. And as rough as it may seem, it's not bad to stand up for yourself or the people around you and you know what's right. Grace did a great job in showing us that. And yeah.